Welcome to the PI Podcast, Political Insights for the Palaging Inis. I'm your host, Matt, and my pronouns are he and him. And here's my co-host, political scientist, meme lord, and emerging gender studies scholar who is publishing a critique against Judith Butler relating alienation, illiberalism from genitalia.
What
Forge.
the hell? But yeah, I did write against Butler, but for a different issue. Pinagtanggol siya ng mga kawatan niya, so and that got me rejected. Anyway, PI nyo, PI nating lahat, board share at your service.
And if I'm right, your pronouns are lo and nong. Mano.
My pronoun is it.
Anyway, so today we have this, of course, continuing the Understanding Ideology series. And last time we had conservatism with Jay Aruga. That was a fun conversation.
Yep.
But today, like, we're doing, of course, a Women's Month special. And it's funny because this is like the first time we're actually talking about like women's issues, like, because for the most part, I think most of our guests have been guys, so it's a bit of a sausage fest. So I don't know. It's probably because our potentially misogynistic podcast name. I hope it's not the case. No, it's really not. It's political insights for Lagdinis. It's not that other thing. Actually, for legal reasons, it's not. For anecdotal things, sure. But so we're going to talk about another ideology, which is feminism. Now, Borge, since it's Women's Month, what do you think about women and feminism? Like, do you read any women, or like, do you enjoy any women? Yeah.
What can I say about women? Well, they are wonderful, but paraphrasing Sigmund Freud in his later life, I don't know jack shit about women.
Sigmund Freud.
Well, that's basically Sigmund Freud in the latter part of his life. So he admitted that he doesn't really know anything about the women's psyche. But for feminism, to be honest, this is basically this is a review episode for me, really. I'm looking forward to learning more about feminism because I have, let's just say, I have ignored the theory itself in my own studies. So I have my own focus on democracy and citizenship and socialism and workers. But
ignored, baka neglected.
Neglected, yeah. Neglected would be apt. But how many women scholars do you have in your library?
Scholars. Well, I have a very big collection of Hannah Arendt, which we talked about in the podcast, and I read a bit of Mary Shelley, like, who was one of the major authors of, like, again, Frankenstein and sci-fi. But admittedly, I myself don't read a lot of women, but I do admire a lot of women. Like, for example, I enjoy the music of Lady Gaga. Or, of course, I used to read Judith Butler, Simone de Beauvoir, and all that. These are, again, feminist authors. But again, they haven't been quite, part of my focus, which is why it is very much a good opportunity for us to, again, review and to focus on women and the important role women have in society in general, and like Philippine society right now. Like, Philippines in particular is a country that has elected a female president before America has. Of course, because of other things, but yeah, and we have like women running for very high positions in government right now. Yeah, with Manny Robredo and Sara Duterte, which we'll talk about later on with our guest. And our guest right now is definitely very much well immersed in like women's studies. So let me just introduce her. So Miss Noelle Dela Cruz is a full professor of philosophy at De La Salle University, where she received her PhD in philosophy and her MFA in creative writing. Her poetry collection, The Sisyphus on Penrose Stairs, Meta Reveries, published by Vagabond Press, won first prize for poetry in English at the 2017 Palanca Awards. And in 2016 to 2017, she served as a fellow for poetry of the Benvenido and Santos Creative Writing Center. She's the lead author in the senior high course textbook, Philosophy of a Human Person, Giving Meaning to Life, published by Oxford University Press. And she co-edited an anthology, Feminista, Gender, Race, and Class in the Philippines, published by Anvil Press. She serves as editorial consultant and book review editor for the International Journal of Philosophy. With feminist philosopher colleagues, she publishes a bi-monthly Substack newsletter, Beyond the Ghetto, which aims to mainstream the works of women philosophers. And BTG's Beyond the Ghetto's Facebook page will be accessed in the link that we will post in the show notes, so you can check out the work they do there. And her research and teaching areas include existential phenomenology, philosophy of literature, and feminist philosophy. So, of course, she's not only a philosopher and study women philosophers, but she's also a poet and also organizer of like this women discussion group. So very much immersed in, of course, the discussions of women. So please welcome our very first female guest, woman guest and women intellectual that on the podcast, Ms. Noelle Dela Cruz. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for the introduction and having me here as a guest. Although I do wonder why you haven't had women guests before. But I'm glad that you broke that cycle, especially because it's Women's Month. I appreciate the thoughts you shared earlier about the dearth of women writers, thinkers, and philosophers in canonical literature in general, which doesn't mean that they're not there. It's just that, right, due to the confluence of factors, their works had been marginalized. So thank you for doing your part to try to correct that and shed light on women's and gender issues.
Well, we're glad that you accepted our offer, and I think we're very happy to have you here. Okay, so let's start first, like to ask. Of course, you've had a lot to do with like in publication and writing about women, and discussing with women. But where did it all begin? Why did you begin like studying women? And your relationship with feminism, the topic we have for today.
All right. The anecdote I often share whenever I think about my beginnings as a feminist, that anecdote usually has to do with my major class on Nietzsche taught by Dr. Victor Gahoko. He's my colleague now in the philosophy department. So Nietzsche is one of the most virulent anti-feminists in philosophy. So there are plenty of quotes from him that are really outrageous and shocking. But Nietzsche is kind of in a class of his own, because some scholars would say that his anti-feminism is also paradoxical. Of course, that's a different topic altogether. Let's just say that reading him for the first time as an undergraduate student made me think about my own place as a woman in philosophy. Reading all of these male philosophers who have all of these things to say about women, so it's, you can't help but feel alienated, and that feeling of not belonging made me pursue this topic even more. The whole issue of, women in philosophy. Of course, philosophy is my intellectual background, but coming into feminism, as you know, any feminist researcher can't help but be interdisciplinary in their concerns, because feminism transcends disciplines, it transcends theory, which is why I think we do have a lot to talk about, given that this series is called Your Ideology series, and I believe feminists have kind of an ambivalent relationship with that concept, ideology. But as far as my roots in feminism, that was from my undergraduate years in philosophy. Back in the 90s, when there weren't a lot of feminists yet in our department, I'm happy to say that now, 20 years later, there are many women. We're much more enlightened now in our own department. So aside from doing my thesis on feminist philosophy, I was also one of the first to teach gender studies in DLSU. So believe it or not, there was a time in our university history when gender wasn't taught at all, And when I was an undergraduate student, there was no course on gender studies. I believe these days they call it gender and multiculturalism. But back in the 90s, there were no such courses. When I was invited to teach back in 2003, it was purposely to teach that course. Yes. And then, so in a way, I've been doing feminism since I was an undergraduate student. But of course, getting into graduate school, I also diversified, but I never really lost my interest in gender-related issues. And my most recently, actually as a result of the pandemic, I think this group of women philosophers kind of organically formed. We've always known each other during face-to-face conferences and all that. But it was because of the pandemic and the increasing reliance on social media platforms and Zoom conferencing that we kind of got together. It made it easier actually to connect virtually. It's so ironic. You couldn't see each other face to face, but there's so much communication and coordination going on online. And because of that, before I knew it, we formed this women doing philosophy group. And we formed this initiative called Beyond the Ghetto. It kind of snowballed, from reading group discussion to this organization with so many projects. And I've never been so electrified, because you know how it is when you meet a group. Of course, you've always met them, but you've always known each other. But this time around, there's a sudden synergy. And because of that, what you could have accomplished as an individual is so much less than what you could do as a group. And that's what's mind-boggling for me. So it was due to these, it's because of these women and women allies of women and feminist allies that I continue to be energized in feminism.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
a long time, definitely. So I'm curious now, of course, from that backstory, perhaps from your experience, what is feminism? And I think you have enough background to also what is feminism in a way become, since it's been around for quite a long time, so it's evolved as a concept. So maybe you can tell us a bit of an overview of what that is.
Okay.
What is feminism?
Well, of course, there are many schools of strands of feminism, intellectual traditions, waves of feminist thought. There are actually so many ways you could taxonomize this movement. I think at the very least we could call it a movement, because it wouldn't be feminism without that political dimension. So it's a movement that works for the rights and liberation of women. But that's a very, very baseline, simplistic definition, because feminism is also, despite the term, obviously it's about humankind, because the moment you start talking about a specific aspect of a person, let's say race or economic class, you can't really reduce an individual to just one aspect. You have to bring in the whole, all of those dimensions. So feminism, for all that, it's basically or fundamentally about women and girls are part of humanity. It's obviously it's also about humanity. So it's, in other words, it's not just for women; it's for everybody.
Okay.
I'm curious though. You mentioned that, of course, philosophy has begun by dead white old men. A lot of them have like beards and are white, And you're right in that it's weird for men to be commenting on women, but I think where can you say where can you trace the beginning of like a feminist ideology or feminist thinking? Because I think if I recall correctly, the earliest that I know of, and this was done told to me by a friend, was Christine de Pizan, if you're familiar. It is like 1390, I think. She lived in the 1300s, and she talked about the city of ladies. So she wrote something about how women should behave. But would you consider this as okay? This might be esoteric, but yeah, is that feminist thinking, or where would you locate the beginning of feminism?
Okay, I think feminism, as we understand the concept today, feminism as a movement, would be a modern phenomenon, definitely, as much as it's tied up with ideas of freedom and equal rights and rationality. So it's a product of Enlightenment thought. But despite that, I think we could say that there were some proto-feminists, even before the movement as such came to be launched. If you look at scholarly histories of feminism, what they would call the first wave feminists were usually the suffragists, those who advocated for the right to vote, their equal rights in general for women. So 19th century thinkers, women like Mary Wollstonecraft, for example. And then after that, in the 20th century, you have the second wave and all that. But I appreciate Matt's point that even as far back as the medieval times, in fact, even as far back as the ancient times, you've had these women thinkers whose works, by the way, were unearthed largely due to, the feminist movement, which was a modern. So they were really modern discoveries, these pre-modern voices, which we now retrospectively call proto-feminist. So I think it's always been there, these ideas. It's just a matter of looking and placing a value on those voices. So actually, an even older woman's voice is Diotima. And Diotima was, of course, Socrates' teacher.
Oh.
Yeah.
So Socrates was taught by a woman. That's interesting. Diotima, right?
Yes.
I did not know that actually.
Oh, that's a new info.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm shocked by that. So that's interesting. Actually, like they've been existed in philosophy and writing for as far back as Socrates. But perhaps maybe we can move back to present day a bit first, and perhaps how would you differentiate, of course, these writings with feminist ideology and how it is practiced in politics? How would you differentiate? Yeah.
Yes, that's a great question. And I think a very relevant one, given that I'm talking to political scientists, I love political philosophy. I really believe that the state is probably the single most important influential institution, in human society. Sometimes I wonder if it's more influential than the family. The term ideology, it carries a lot of baggage, right? On one hand, there's this sense that if you begin with ideology, you have like tunnel vision, so that all your arguments would not be on the service of what reason demands, but what your belief system demands. So so there's this view of ideology as somehow an overarching framework, some meta-narrative that cannot be contested by something like reason. But of course, being philosophers, we like to problematize even such a nuanced critique and say that reason itself. One might argue that reason itself is kind of an ideology to the extent that you put it up on a pedestal and single it out as the sole arbiter of. I mean, this is one of the insights we got, not just from feminists, but also from critical race theorists and Marxists. This deconstruction of reason. So on one hand, there's that negative view of ideology. On the other hand, there's this more positive view of it as somehow putting theory into service. In fact, turning theory over on its head in the way that Marx did. The Marxist rallying cry of how philosophy, should not just theorize about the world; it should change it, right? And of course, feminism has so many affinities with Marxism. Yeah, in as much as it's really about political change. If there's no political dimension to it, if there's no liberatory agenda, it couldn't. Any view, I think, couldn't call itself feminist. So ideology, I think, yeah. So it's so interesting to me to talk about this as a philosopher and as a feminist philosopher, because of the ambivalence. On one hand, you want to be a philosopher and say you're kind of above ideology. You're a critic of ideology. But on the other hand, if you don't have an ideology, if you don't at the very least acknowledge the influence of it, then what are all your theories for? What are they based on? Are you just an ivory tower scholar? And all that. So I'd like to question that dichotomy, so that ideology is neither all bad or all good. So I'd like to think of it as kind of in a dialectic with feminism. On one hand, you're not enslaved by the ideology, so that you're not reductivist, because that could also hinder your own thinking. For example, as someone who studied the feminist movement and all of its developments, as you know, there are really very, very radical strands of feminism. And of course, the radicality is, if you put it in context, you'd understand why certain feminists thought in the way that they did. But some of these strands of feminism can be very, very reductivistic as well. So I think those could be instances wherein the ideology took up so much energy. It prevented some of the feminists from being self-critical and self-reflective. But on the other hand, if you don't have ideology, I don't think you could call yourself a feminist either. If it's just if it's all just abstraction for you.
Right.
So yeah, in relation to that, I do want maybe you could enlighten me a bit about your own conceptualization of your ideology series. I mean, what's your own definition of ideology?
Want to handle that?
Regarding that one, we're actually, I do agree with your points regarding the positive and negative sides of ideology. I think that the most recent examination of ideology tries to transcend positive and negative. And Michael Frieden argued that ideology is, our conceptual map. It's how we understand the world, and basically determines how we behave in it, how we interact with the world based on how we understand it. Ang pinakaiba ng ideology sa theory is that an ideology provides you with absolute answers. Just as you have said, it's a basis for plans of action. So certainty. But the theory is something that generates more and more questions, because the goal of a theory is to understand. So regarding that one, so as a theory, what are the major questions that the feminist theory have provided or have posited against, male-dominated society?
Yes. Well, in as much as historians of feminism identify a first wave and a second wave, and some allege that there's a third wave. Let me just answer in terms of these distinctive periods of feminist thinking.
Sure.
Which are also a function of our historical development, because certain times required an original way of thinking. For example, the whole idea of equal rights, and without which I don't think feminists in the 20th century would have been able to think of gender as a concept at all, or liberation, which is quite apart from from equality. And furthermore, I don't think we could think of a very third wavy idea, such as intersectionality. Even before we had uh, uh, a basic idea of what gender is all about. So going back to Matt's question, what are the main problems of feminist theory? Of course, I would like I would prefer to speak of feminist theories. So I would say it would be a good way of thinking about them in an organized way. Is in terms of these waves. So you have this preoccupation. There's a lot of feminist literature from the 19th century, for example, which is all about, in that way we can class them along with Enlightenment thought. Equality is all about everyone's human, everyone has reason, so it shouldn't matter, what your sex is, as long as you're rational, you participate in the polity and all that. So this is the base, very, very basic, let's say liberal strand of thought. On the other hand, another idea which I think we owe to feminism, more specifically Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex, is her idea of gender. The idea that being male or female in society has something to do with certain social roles and expectations assigned to a person on the basis of their maleness or femaleness. So the intertwinement of biology and culture, sex and gender, and how gender, notwithstanding equal rights, so that in a society where men and women have equal rights, it doesn't mean you have achieved this genderless utopia. Gender will always still be there. There will still be double standards in regard to gender. You can have, a very simplistic example would be, you can have a workplace where men and women have equal pay for equal work, but there might be different expectations of them because one is a woman and one is a man. For example, the woman, might be expected to write the minutes of the meeting, serve the coffee, whatever, right? Or if a man, for example, has a family and they take time off for their children, it's something admirable. But if something a woman does, she's not praised for something she is expected to do already in the first, things like that, right?
Yes.
So there is that, all that thinking about gender. But now, based on my own observations about what issues preoccupy my women colleagues and feminist colleagues, we're very concerned now about intersectionality. So that when feminists think gender, it's always in tandem with race, economic class, sexual orientation, nationality and all that. So you can't really be, when we speak of feminist issues, it's always a localized, very localized issue. For example, one of the topics I've been really interested in political philosophy has to do with care-based feminist political philosophies, those that integrate this theory of care, ethics of care, in critiques of more justice-based political paradigms. And an issue that I think is especially relevant in the Philippine context has to do with what feminists call global care chains. This pertains to how we offload care work to the next person. So that, for example, if you're a person in a developed country earning this kind of salary, you could easily afford paying a domestic, usually from a country like the Philippines, for example.
Okay.
Because we have so many domestic workers and caregivers abroad.
Yeah.
So you pay them, and these caregivers, would migrate to your country. They would leave behind their own families and children in need of care themselves. And usually these caregivers belong to the middle classes, and they themselves could afford to hire other carers, usually from the provinces and usually women, to take care of their household and the other caregiving needs. So there's a kind of pass on care work, that goes on in this chain. And of course, the work is still feminized, right? It's still work that women are expected to do, but some women are more free of it,
right?
Because of their income or where they are in the world. So it's a very concerning issue for feminists.
Okay.
Yeah, even though women are not equal with respect to each other.
Yeah.
It involves all of these geopolitical nuances.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a lot of context, but I just want to dial back. I just want to perhaps maybe summarize a bit and to. So I think you mentioned Simone de Beauvoir, and I think one of her famous quotes is, "One is not born a woman, one becomes a woman." And I think you mentioned earlier that there's a distinction between biological sex, meaning, of course, your biological makeup, meaning your genitalia, whether your role in the sexual act of reproduction, and of course, whether if you're a man, you're assigned gender roles, because it's the gender roles that are socially constructed and not part of your biology, but it's assigned in the classical patriarchal society, that men are assigned to be like warriors, leaders, and managers, etc., while the women are assigned to being household help or ever in secretaries, and like as you mentioned. And I just want to also highlight, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the link between of course, the goal of feminist theory and feminist ideology and feminist politics. It's of course the general role is to highlight the dignity and the value of women around the world, and of course this is related to specific struggles. So the first wave, you mentioned the three waves of feminism. The first wave is the suffragettes movement, meaning the basic right to vote, to be recognized as citizens. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember this too much. The second wave is about, again, against discrimination in the workplace.
The role of women in society.
Role of women in society. So they're already out working with in the economy, so they're still being discriminated and they're not being paid equally. I think that's one of the issues. The gender pay gap is an issue in the second wave. And the third wave, which is a bit more radical, and I do want to get your comments on this, and on how some people call this the women's supremacy. Women are better than men, something like that. So the feminism Philippines have these similar waves, or was it different? So maybe you can perhaps move from these waves in America, Western, developments of feminism, to the Philippines.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that summary.
Yeah.
Although I would say that third wave feminism, the way that I mentioned it earlier, I think it has more to do not so much with female supremacy.
Sorry,
intersectionality.
But with, yes.
Intersectionality. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
That is a stereotype. Sorry, the third wave is usually.
Ito naman to, natakot agad sa galit sa. Lumalabas, nakakalata ka mat.
That's how I remember it from class. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
To be fair, there's a strand of feminist thought, which has been called woman-centered feminism, and to a certain extent, that may be interpreted as saying that we should invert the paradigm. Instead of,
Mm.
patriarchy, let's have a matriarchy. Instead of masculinity being privileged, let's privilege femininity. But of course, those woman-centered, sometimes they're also called difference feminisms, have blind spots of their own.
Right.
Primarily, the problem of essentialism. They essentialize all women as universally the same, but of course, women are different. So yeah, it's interesting that you brought up those associations. These stereotypes, of course, have some basis on fact, which makes the history of feminisms interesting as well. So could we go back to your question after you summarize? Yes. So you were asking about whether the history of feminism in the Philippines also follows, these the pattern of these waves, in the West. So interestingly, when I did some research on that, Filipino feminist philosophers. This is the article that I contributed, to our 2011 anthology, which was part of the Centennial publication, DLSU Centennial publications. So the title of our anthology is Feminist, Gender, Race, and Class in the Philippines. And my chapter there is about feminist philosophy in the Philippines, whether there were any Filipino feminist philosophers. And based on my research, we actually also followed the arc of first wave, second wave, and third wave. If only because our education system is really very Americanized. We cannot help but imbibe these enlightenment thinking as well. So Clemencia Lopez, for example, I consider as a proto-feminist who had a very liberal agenda when she addressed American colonialists, because she was an anti-colonialist at that time, and she appealed to gender as something that she shared with the women American women who were also anti-colonialists, and based on my research, aside from Clemencia Lopez, who I considered as a first wave thinker, there was also Sister Mary Jo Mananzan, who is very much a second wave thinker. No introduction needed for Sister Mary Jo Mananzan, of course. And aside from that, we also have a bunch of intersectional thinkers who were not just concerned about gender, but also all these other, how it intersects with race, class, and sexual orientation. In fact, I think contemporary feminist philosophers now, me and all these women in the Women Doing Philosophy group, are very much intersectional. Yeah, if there's such a thing as third wave, is really the generation, our generation now as feminist thinkers. So yeah, I think it more or less follows that those waves of feminist thought. Although some scholars would say that the Philippines, if you consider our pre-colonial history anyway, there's some scholars who say that we had a matriarchal kind of culture, especially with the high value placed on the babaylan figure, and how women could own land before the Spaniards came. And so that may all well be true, but I don't think it's fruitful to
go back.
Romanticize. I mean, we are where we are right now, right? Yeah.
I mean, that's funny. I actually read that. I have a copy of the compilation Feminista right here, and I think it said in the chapter is that, Philippines is, you mentioned there, Philippines is one of the most westernized country in Asia, but it's also one of the most modern in terms of in terms of its treatment of women, like so technically, like women right now, like I mentioned earlier, can run for office. They're more or less respected. So I was wondering if you can comment on perhaps what makes feminism in the Philippines a bit different, because I think you mentioned they do follow a similar trend. They use concepts like Marxism and liberalism. They're Filipino feminist liberals and Filipino feminist Marxists. Yeah, so that's interesting because we do share certain political conditions that allow them to apply these concepts. But is there anything particularly Filipino about their thought, or Filipino about feminism here?
Okay, that's such pregnant question, but yeah, I like that question. There's so much to unpack there. As you know, the whole idea of Filipino identity is already it's contentious, right?
Sure.
It's Filipino and identity and all that. So in philosophy, there's a debate about whether there is such a thing as Filipino philosophy, in a way that scholars point to the existence of, let's say, Greek philosophy, or German philosophy. So my own view on that is, if you go by the Wittgensteinian theory of meaning, the meaning of something is how we use it, right? So German philosophy is really philosophy done by Germans, So if you define Filipino philosophy as philosophy done by Filipinos, yeah, there is feminist philosophy. There is Filipino philosophy. It's just that they're not all about Filipino-ness and Filipino identity. So any philosophy you do, and you're a Filipino, makes what you do, Filipino philosophy. So I think the same goes for what we call Filipino feminist philosophy. There are some who would say that there is no such thing as a Filipino philosophy, or much less a Filipino feminist philosophy. But I think those views are coming from the essentialist assumption that there's a collection of let's say, cultural traits or issues or topics that are unique to let's say Filipinos, so that if what you do could be called Filipino philosophy, you should address those or manifest those traits, as it were. But I don't think there is such. Writings have in common is the very bare fact that they were written by Filipinos or citizens of the Philippines, and that's pretty much it. Which is not to deny that there is such a thing as Filipino culture, or that we understand what we mean by being Filipino or Filipino-ness. There is, right? I just refuse to. I don't want to engage with that very essentializing question of for me, it's as long as you're Filipino, whether you because Filipino means you could still be literally a citizen of the Philippines, or you could be abroad. You could have renounced your citizenship and become Dutch like my sister, or American like my parents.
Right.
It doesn't make you any less of a Filipino, and you cannot help but address things that are relevant to where you came from, or where your society is headed, especially the society that you come from and continue to be part of, regardless of your geographical location.
Okay. I think I do have one follow-up question regarding identity. So I think we can agree that identity is complex and multifaceted and still ongoing. I think it would always be under construction. It would never as far as Chantal Mouffe is concerned, civic
Women
identity would
writer.
always be.
Chantal Mouffe is a
Chantal,
woman.
Chantal Mouffe is. I'm a fan. So she's essential to my own writings. But I think my question would be regarding Chantal Mouffe's argument that civic identity is supposed to be an intersection between different, other identities, from workers to gender to ethno-linguistic identity. But my question would be, what can feminism here in the Philippines contribute to the formation of a civic identity for Filipinos?
Good one.
Oh, okay. First of all, I think I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry for the background noise. That's my dog. In case you're wondering,
Okay.
the little growling in there. But, as a feminist who's coming from the discipline of philosophy, one of the things that I realized, one of my important realizations was coming to appreciate my own privilege. I've long since accepted that my feminism is a middle class kind of feminism. Unfortunately, I think that much of what we call feminism in philosophy is really middle class feminism,
right?
Because that's where we are. You can't really expect, for example, you're a woman farmer or peasant. It's not like you can write a book, about your thoughts about philosophy, and so really those are marginalized voices. So when we if we ask about what feminists can contribute to the formation of a civic identity, I think it's not what we can contribute, because it's more of what we could listen to, or what spaces we could open up.
Right.
Which I think is what we're doing in Beyond the Ghetto, right? We're trying to mainstream feminism, so it's not just for, let's say, philosophers or academics. Anyone can attend our webinars, for example, and we like to hear from non-philosophers as well, people who actually do advocacy work. For example, now that the May elections are coming up, my women's group, had been brainstorming all of these ways we could raise consciousness about issues that impact on gender, which I think is very much ignored in the platform of current presidential candidates. That I was reflecting on the questions, for this, the issues that will be raised in this podcast.
Right.
One of those issues, as Matt mentioned earlier, what can we say about the platforms of these presidential balls? And I'm sorry to say that none of them, even my favorite, Dr. Robredo, has clear, agenda, about gender. Their platforms are really very, very general, which speaks of the status of women and girls in the Philippines. You have that view of. I'm sorry, it's my dog.
It's just cute.
We could try to edit it. Yeah.
No. Sorry.
That's so cute.
It's fine.
So for all that we are said to have had a pre-colonial matriarchal culture.
Yes.
For all that millennial women especially can be very vocal about their rights, and the Me Too movement, has also penetrated the culture and all that. Nonetheless, if you think about the lack of divorce in the Philippines and the fact that you can't have an abortion in the Philippines. The Philippines is so much worse even than the state of Texas in the US, if you think about it, right? So yeah, I don't think that I think the situation of women and girls in the Philippines is that pretty much medieval. If you compare, the presence or absence of certain rights, that other countries comparatively have. So I think if women feel that they're doing okay here, it's because they have money, or they belong
right
more comfortable classes where you could afford something like an annulment if you don't feel like your marriage is going great, or you're educated so you know about contraception, you don't have to deal with unwanted pregnancies.
Right.
Okay. So
I want to move actually a bit. I was supposed to ask this, and I think this should have been asked first before this civic identity. But I was curious what you thought about how Philippine society sees women in general. Like I think you mentioned already that there's still a lot of rights denied to them, like abortion or contraception or a divorce. But perhaps besides that, I think. Well, if I may contribute, I think in general, like women are a bit more respected than compared to other societies.
Yeah, we've been
like
in China for a while.
True.
China.
Yeah. But we're doing much better than women in China. But in the Philippines, actually, if you notice, even in our Catholicism, like we have a lot of emphasis on the Virgin Mary and how mothers more or less are very much venerated in our society. We have some of our most famous actresses, are actually well venerated and respected. So, and I think, politically speaking, I mentioned already we had two female presidents. You have Cory Aquino and you have Arroyo, and then we also have like Gabriela Party List, which represents women's interests. So in many ways, there are Philippine society has done advanced in that aspect, but is there anything else that needs to be done, in your estimation, like how our society sees and treats women?
Okay. Sorry, I was trying to quiet my dog, but he's just doing his own thing over there.
Okay.
Okay. So those are very salient observations. On one hand, it's good that we've had at least two Filipina presidents, and potentially another one if Robredo wins.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Oh, thank you. It's nice to be with joke. That's good. On the other hand, even if you have a female president, doesn't necessarily mean that she advocates, for example,
for women's rights.
Platforms for women and girls. You can have a very conservative leader like Margaret Thatcher, for example. So yeah, in terms of representation, in politics, it's well and good that we can have women presidents, but it would be better if they were also feminist presidents. I think that's the real utopia that is yet to come. Now, with regard to women being venerated in our culture, especially because of, let's say, the status of the Virgin Mary, in our iconography and all that, feminists tend to be leery of, on one hand, you could venerate femininity, but sometimes it's obtained through a kind of dichotomizing, where you have the good women to be venerated, and of course, the only way you can have that is if you have the antithesis of that, the bad women, So on one hand, you have
the Madonna whore. That's I remember that.
I've never really thought of religion. I think of the monotheistic religions, the great monotheistic religions, as patriarchal. So for all that they venerate, it venerates women, it is also a kind of veneration with a price, you know. If you think about it, putting a burqa on a woman is a way of quote unquote venerating, you know, their body, but really it's so in other words, it's not the veneration,
but liberation.
Yes. You don't want to be venerated if being venerated implies being an object. So but yes, but to go back to Matt's question, what can we say about the status of women in the Philippines? So yeah, I you know, because of some of the privileges that I acknowledge I have, I'm not sure I qualify as a woman here, you know, because as a, you know, as a person, you know, with, belonging to the middle class and who has the job that I have, you know, you know, I can afford, let's say, house help, you know, I can travel, you know, I have the benefit of education and all that. I can think of myself as being, you know, beyond all that, you know,
right.
But I probably represent just a very small percentage of, you know, women in the Philippines. So yeah, I don't think it's the picture is very sanguine, you know, for the majority of women and girls in the Philippines. And I say this as female philosopher who came to feminism through an experience of alienation. So you could be very privileged already and still feel alienated, you know. And at the end of the day, you know, there are so many others who are, you know, worse off, you know. So yeah. So in other words, if you're really interested in advocating for gender-related issues, maybe you could interview next time someone who's really subaltern, you know. I have, I can put you in contact with some of my colleagues, you know, in women doing philosophy. If you're interested in sustaining a feminist conversation.
Okay.
Because I'm coming from the perspective of philosophy, so it's really more theoretical, you know.
Okay.
But there are so many other people who have, you know, on the ground advocacies that you might find interesting to dialogue with.
I think I have been exposed to a bit of that way before. One of our mutual friends, she invited me to join a small focus group discussion on her project regarding the financial role of women in the household. And then we interviewed low household women.
Low income household.
Yeah, low income household income. So the picture that I got and what the respondents provided is at the level of the household, women is the master. So so they're trying to pilot test a microcredit system, and they needed to take into account the role of the mother of the household. And if my memory serves me correct, the result is such decisions are made with the mother. So it's mostly the mother in consultation with the husband. But for the pocket of the household is for yung asawa at yung nanay ang may hawak. So that's at the level of. So I think if we are to study the role of women in society, you're right. I think we need to take into account the intersectionality. So we cannot tackle women as it is. We need to look at women in relation to social class, in relation to their position in the economy, so on and so forth.
Right.
Oh, which is. But I think just to cap it, no, not really cap it off, but to just a point. I don't know if you would agree with this one, but
yes.
I am I correct in saying that the feminist movement leans more to exposing areas for discussion rather than imposing yourself on, except for the fringe radicals. Is it more concerned with creating spaces for discussing marginalized issues rather than imposing yourself on everyone else?
Well, on one hand, you do need to one of the things that you have to relearn about being a woman is shocking off these behavioral expectations, being meek and being a follower and being nice all the time. And to that end, you do need some kind of assertiveness. So assertiveness is good. And so I think the imposition of views is part of the process, but it's not the be all and end all. So you want to be assertive, you want to be heard, but at the same time, you also you don't want to leave the system unchanged, by creating something as patriarchal. For example, one of the well-known critiques of feminism about philosophy is that we have what we call an adversarial kind of paradigm, especially in terms of, how philosophers are all about the Socratic, dialogue. So we're gonna tear your argument apart. I'm gonna embarrass you in front of everybody, and just gonna. It's all about being adversarial, right? It's all about tearing someone down. So as a feminist, you don't want to you don't want to keep that system in place and simply become a female Socrates doing the same tearing down. So you want to make space as well, listen instead of just talk. So there's something paradoxical about that. You're kind of living behind femininity, but on the other hand, you're revaluing it as well. So here we're speaking of issues that remain contentious in feminism. Actually, you have all of these feminist positions that occasionally contradict each other, that kind of debate each other, and you may have come across in your own reading of feminist literature how, for example, liberal feminisms are often opposed to radical feminisms. They tend to have different positions on like pornography and prostitution, and to say nothing of Marxist feminism. So what I like about feminisms is it remains an agora of ideas. And so it's
agora marketplace.
That's what I like about it. Is the spaces that are opened up. It is again one of the things I enjoy about women doing philosophy in our Beyond the Ghetto project.
I'm actually curious now about. Of course, I assume you might have had conversations with students, and in my own classes, technically, I do have a lot of students who are outspoken about feminism, about women's issues, and aggressively so. Like they even talk about things like rape culture, or about how many, like how a lot of, for example, they refuse to read some of the readings because they're done by a white man, like Aristotle. Yeah, but I'm curious as to how do you deal with perhaps like. Wait, let me ask you first. Like, how are your conversations with perhaps like-minded, like feminism, or maybe, and how do you handle them? Like maybe these different temperaments. Well, not necessarily. They're not all like radicals, but I was wondering, how do you facilitate these conversations with, perhaps in the classroom, or maybe in your own discussion groups? If there are these different moods, like some are radicals, some are not, some. So how do you handle them? Like, what are they like?
First of all, I get where they're coming from. I understand the radicalism or the impulse for radicalism, because as an undergraduate student who first came into feminism during my early feminist days, I was really, angry, and it's understandable, especially if you're realizing it for seemingly the first time. And that's one of the things I notice about the so-called millennial generation. They're very, pardon the term, woke. And actually, as somebody who taught gender studies, first taught gender studies 20 years ago, this is actually a refreshing thing for me because I've experienced handling classes that were very, very conservative. And I was in my early 20s at the time that I was teaching gender studies. It was very new in the university. And I remember how whenever I would talk about reproductive freedom and rights, it was always a challenge. And when it came to teaching about feminism, I always felt defensive about it. Like I had to explain why there is such a thing as feminism. But now, when I encountered, you know, the millennial generation of students, it's they're coming from a different set of assumptions. It's not like you have to defend feminism anymore. It's like you have to defend why you're not a feminist, you know. You have to defend why you're not woke, you know. So it's so on one hand that's a good thing because, you know, education works, right? I mean that this is a very tangible proof that we got through to people. On the other hand, as an educator, right, you also want to temper some of these radicalized impulses, if you will. It's on one hand, I like that they're critical, but on the other hand, you don't want their woke biases because I think wokeness can be a bias as well, right? I mean, yeah, you don't want that to become a kind of blindfold, you know, to their appreciation of certain texts. Because if you think about it, if you just live your life by wokeness, if that's the standard by which you judge all texts, no one would be left uncancelled, right? especially in philosophy, right? As somebody who teaches existential phenomenology, for example, whenever I teach Heidegger, for example, he was a Nazi, right? I mean, there's no way you could get around that. Immanuel Kant was a racist, so was David Hume. So you could. Aristotle was he was definitely an anti-feminist in the sense that he didn't think that women, children, or slaves were persons in the rational sense. But this doesn't mean that you can't use Aristotle's ideas, even Heidegger's ideas. I tell my graduate students that for all that Heidegger was a Nazi, you can actually use Heidegger to argue against Heidegger, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
I appreciate the cancellation impulse. I mean, I think it's coming from good intentions, right? But at the same time, as an educator, you don't want them to throw out the baby with the bathwater, you know. So be critical, but don't defeat yourself by giving up what's good with the text.
I my own solution for that one is, again, we historically contextualize the thinkers. So, and then that's also facilitating a fruitful reading of a certain text. You contextualize it. So this was the history, and regarding Aristotle, actually, Ellen, I forgot her name, Wood, the political theorist, actually re-examined Aristotle's portrayal of Athens. So Aristotle's portrayal of Athens is actually relatively inaccurate in comparison to that one. So, and then, but then again, it's too much woke is. That's why I think that is also one of the implicit justifications for this series on ideology, right, Matt? trying to prevent too much woke.
Actually, I think you answered it a bit, but this is a question that we plan to ask everyone who comes on the podcast on ideology. So, what do you think are the limitations of feminism, whether it be ideology or theory, or like what for example, what are the things that you might get wrong, you know, and how do you think feminism should address these limitations?
Okay. That's thank you for that question. It's not something, I must admit, it's not something that I ever asked myself, you know how it is when you advocate for something, you don't really think of it as, it's not, you know, an advocacy is not something you evaluate for pros and cons. Uh, uh, it's a lifestyle and a mindset that you just embody, you know. So you're just thrown into it. So I can't really say I've evaluated feminism in the same way that I've evaluated, let's say, other philosophies. Because other philosophies are intellectual, you know, activities for me, you know, but feminism is the way I live my life, for example. It's the way I am in the world. So I'm not sure, it's something I have to think about. If I don't think of it as having a weakness, because the alternative not to be a feminist is just unthinkable for me. It would be the equivalent of, to not be a feminist is the equivalent of not being able to see and being blind. So it's not really a, being feminist is not a position I could evaluate in terms of what are its strengths or weaknesses. It's a manner of seeing, you know, that is essential. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I understand.
It's a difficult question.
Difficult. Yeah.
But anyway, food for
it could
thought.
be, yeah, but maybe not necessarily yourself, but maybe do you see other feminists and you just say, ooh, it's embarrassing. like definitely, like on our own side, like there's other political scientists that are embarrassing. I won't mention them here, but yeah, I mean, it's even amongst our own sides, you know.
You know, regarding that one, I think, okay, you know, that's just a brain fart right now. Like, probably this is something that I have been hiding in my subconscious. One reason why I'm avoiding, or not really avoiding, but neglecting feminist thought is that I think I stumbled early on in my life that the weakness of Marxism is feminism. I think that's
because you're a Marxist.
Yeah, I think that's you know, that's, you know, I just thought about it right now. I think that, you know, when I passed through a time when still now I'm still criticizing my own tendencies regarding Marxism, and I think that's one of the conclusions that I arrived at, that Marxism is, you know, near incapable of addressing issues on gender. So yeah, but that is a very difficult question, really.
I think if you think of the weakness of a certain perspective, in terms of its blind spot, so Marxism's blind spot about gender, for example, so that actually put into mind this relatively recent issue with the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia. Earlier, Borges was talking about instances when some school of thought made him embarrassed about being associated with that school of thought. For example, when this controversy came out, you know, it was there was a big to do, you know, on social media. For context, it's about this philosopher who compared transsexualism with transracialism. So she said that she argued in her paper that if we are willing to recognize men who identify as women, then we should also recognize the case of, for example, Rachel Dolezal, who was born a white woman, but who thought of herself as a Black person and displayed, you know, as a Black person, basically lived as a Black person. So she compared transracialism with transsexualism, which is a kind of no-no, right? Because, well, first of all, those are two very different things. And transgenders and transgender advocates would think that, it's a false analogy. And so basically that article became very, very controversial. And because of the controversy, the board of directors of Hypatia issued an apology without consulting the editorial board. And then they got in trouble for that apology because they were criticized as giving into the woke, whatever, criticisms. So there's this internal debate in philosophy when it comes to this fraught relationship with feminism and transsexualism, right? And I believe this is one of the talking points for this podcast.
Yeah, you can.
Well.
So
since we were talking about blind spots and what weaknesses feminism might have, I think this whole transsexualism issue is really challenging it. Because as you know, there are so-called TERFs,
Yes.
That's
trans exclusionary something feminists.
Yes. There are some feminists, I think they're what Matt would call fringe, they're in the minority in feminist philosophy. Feminism would consider trans women as not women, because they were men and they had male privileges, and they, even if they transition into a female body, their ways of comportment, etc., they have masculine privilege, and you can't let them into female only spaces. So they would argue like female bathrooms, female prisons, and especially trans women who still have their penises, for example.
Right.
But there are others, who would say that that's a very, discriminatory idea. You can, you're basically denying, what people think of themselves, their own gender identity, and so forth. So there's that debate. Yeah. So yeah, if there's, but see, I don't think of this as a weakness of feminism. I actually think of it as one of its strengths, because feminism has always been a contested space, for feminists. We've actually been debating with each other, since Wollstonecraft, since Beauvoir. And I think at some point this debate about transsexuals will also, whether trans women are women, will also become passé at some point.
I see.
So all this discourse is really just contributing to this continuing problematization, of the concept of woman, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, fair.
Okay.
So
I don't know. I'm just curious what you think about this one, that there's also the other way around, where a lot of women or would transition to men. So what does that say about feminism? Why would women give up their quote unquote womanhood? Or did they ever have it in the first place since they're trans? That's another thing. Yeah. What do you think?
Yes. I think that's also something that feminists should support. It's,
I see.
Why would you think that the existence of trans men would be objectionable to feminists?
I see.
Does it have to do with giving up, a woman's body?
I think it's just indicative of a life, the usual life movement of a certain school of thought. Even Marxism had been Marxism right now. We have the post-Marxist,
right?
But the adjustments had been made when class identities collapsed. So now, post-Marxist would now try to absorb, just like Chantal Mouffe, trying to absorb other identities and trying to reform what can be the primary agent for a revolution.
If I can try to make sense of it, I just remember the basic point of the Beauvoir is people become women. In other words, womanhood is something socially constructed or determined by society, and therefore can be negotiated, can be granted, and can be gained, say, by I suppose, social means, that you can be recognized as a woman despite being born biologically male. So if I have it correctly, feminism is about uplifting womanhood, whether that be biologically for biological male or biological female. It's about the empowerment of womanhood, which is again a social construct and has little to do with biological reality. Yeah, if I'm
right.
Yes. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay.
All right. Regarding the Beauvoir, just an anecdote regarding China and the Beauvoir. I still have this picture in my camera. Again, Matt's familiar with the foreign language bookstore, right?
Yeah, we go there. Yeah.
The copy of the Beauvoir's The Second Sex was placed underneath the fiction section.
Wow.
That's China for you. That basically sums up China's relationship with women in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I actually.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I just want to ask. Like, of course, someone came to mind when you talk about TERFs. You talk about J.K. Rowling, who has said that she is a feminist, but she believes that part of womanhood is, of course, the biological reality of it. Like, for example, she talked about early in the pandemic where medical processes, the medical dosage between men and women, the medicines they have are different because like women require smaller doses. And of course, they have biological processes exclusive to that, meaning menstruate. So she reacted, she became to this tweet or this directive towards people who menstruate. In other words, they don't call people who menstruate women because there are women who don't menstruate, according to, of course, a lot of feminist discourse. So what is your reaction to this kind of, again, challenging biology with like womanhood? Yeah.
I think I can rephrase Matt's question. I don't know, Matt, if you would agree with this rephrase. Should there be a split between the biological and the political woman?
Right.
I see.
Yes, I was going to say that it's so appropriate that we were just talking about Beauvoir, because with the Beauvoirian sex gender distinction, you have a very classic feminist position there. Like one is not born a woman, one becomes one, which really means that you may be born male or female or intersex, as the case may be, and all the everything in between, but your being a man or being a woman will not necessarily be dictated by your genitalia because it's something that's culturally formed. So that suggests that if you make this distinction between what is biological and what is cultural, this suggests that transsexualism would be kind of a step back. It's a kind of relinquishing of freedom in favor of the necessity of the body, because it's transgender. The transgender seems to be saying that, I feel like I should have the body of a man or a woman, as the case may be. So you have gender dysphoria, and you would say that it's basically a condition wherein you don't experience your body as being the appropriate body, sex-wise. You feel like you should have, and it's a persistent feeling. It's not just a passing thought, that you really don't feel that you should have the body that you have. You should have the body of the opposite sex. So some feminists of the quote-unquote TERF variety, would say that it's actually a very anti-feminist view. You shouldn't be bound by the body. If you feel like you're a man or a woman, as the case may be, I mean, just you don't have to change your body for that. You just have to, have the attitude and do the role and all of that. On the other hand, I think post-Beauvoir, feminists are starting to realize that it's not so simple to just transcend the body, because that Beauvoir was coming from an existentialist framework. She was coming from this phenomenological assumption that existence precedes essence, right? So it's it really privileges, freedom over necessity. You are what you do, right? And everything else is what? Bad faith, pretending you're not free when you're actually free, But it's not really as simple as that, right? You can't really escape from the embodied reality of race and hormones, ethnicity, even religion. So yeah, that's one of the things that feminists are learning.
I see.
Yeah, on one hand, yeah, gender versus sex. On the other hand, you can have gender dysphoria, and it's not just trans women, obviously, who experience that. Although it would seem that there are more trans women than there are trans men, but there are trans men as well.
Yes.
So yeah, as a feminist, you should also support, a woman who feels that he's a he, right? Or a woman someone who used to be a woman and doesn't consider himself now as such, So yeah, it's part of the, if you want to be consistent, I think, as a feminist.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a very interesting
yes.
issue. Yeah. So yeah, I think J.K. Rowling, I don't think her arguments are, or even her data, are very rational or cogent, I think she's playing into the very transphobic. She's coming from this view of men are, naturally rapists, and if you're a trans woman, you're still a man, and you're automatically violent. And, so yeah, although there had been cases of trans women raping women in women's prisons, I think those are isolated cases and shouldn't be generalized, for all trans women. So there's something of I think she's committing the fallacy of hasty generalization when it comes to her bias against trans women.
I see.
Yeah.
And if you read some of these quote unquote turf writings, they're really ideological in the negative sense of the term. You get the sense that they're coming from a certain view of what transsexuals are, and you get there's no reasoning with them with regard to that view of is so yeah, it's sad about Rowling.
Yeah. Ward, do you want to say something?
No. I think the only generalization that we can do is all sectors have their own sets of assholes.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
I don't know. I'm still kind of torn with that. But on the one hand, yes, and mostly in public places, I think you should be recognized, by law, maybe. But on the other hand, they have the issue of like transsexuals in sports, especially in combat sports, where there are men who transition to women and then dominate and just crack women's skulls.
Right.
So that's also something that is up for discussion.
Shouldn't they just provide a different section for them?
Maybe. Yeah, they can all the transsexual men can fight each other, our own league.
Yeah.
Again, that's not the main question, but it's an interesting subject. Maybe we can continue with an actual transsexual person. But that's thank you for your insight on that.
Yeah.
And I think we've had a long discussion, but we should try to start and wrap this up. And we shall end again with looking at current presidential candidates. And you've already previewed a bit on what
Yes.
you thought of like even female candidates not necessarily being feminist candidates. So let's start with, of course, most interesting, Lenny Robredo. Why don't you think she's feminist enough, or what else do you think about her? Yeah.
Yes, I'm not even sure she identifies as a feminist because
Okay.
she has stated in interviews that she's not in favor of the divorce bill, for example, or and she's also anti-abortion. Um, because in the first place, I'm not sure you could actually win as a presidential candidate in the Philippines if you're in favor of abortion rights or even divorce, and you come out openly about that. So yeah, but yeah, actually, if yeah, having done a survey of what these presidential candidates are vocally for, what I like about Robredo is yeah, she's this squeaky clean. You know, and I think that's her major selling point, right? So she's part of the opposition, and she represents, you know, everything we want to change about the current system. So all the reforms that she's promising, her transparency, and you know, how she's really hands-on. I don't think anyone can fault her for that, you know, for her transparency and the efficacy, you know, of all her projects.
Right.
But yeah, as far as gender is, I'm not sure she gets any points. Which is you know, something to, you know, I could say the same for everyone else, you know? But in comparison with Duterte, I mean, Duterte was really, I think that, you know, it was really a slap in the face for feminists and I think women. Even women who voted for him. It's just mind-boggling to me that a man who admitted to having raped his maid, you know, is taken seriously and venerated in the way that he is, and people laugh at his sexist jokes, which he was never repentant for. You know, it's one of those things I can't believe. Is, you know, I can't even, you know, and yet there it is, right? So yeah,
it's almost over, don't worry. We can hope.
As you said earlier, we're medieval.
So it's in light of the fact that another president would replace Duterte is already, you know, a huge deal for, you know, for feminist advancement, even though the replacement is not a feminist, as long as it's not Duterte, you know, it's already a good thing.
And I think the fact that she chosen the pink rose is also highlighting a feminine style or kind of leadership. So yeah. So as a woman, does she get like points for at the very least being a candidate running? Yeah.
Yes, I believe so. You know, I like how you know, we're embracing the pink, you know.
Yes. Okay. So how about next candidate? We have Bongbong Marcos. So what do you think? Is he a good woman's candidate or a feminist?
I didn't find a lot of information in his because he's been dodging interviews. So I can't really he's not quite as clear as the others about what his platform is. And he's such a controversial figure that, you know, his family history precedes him, you know. So that when I read about you know, his thoughts, they're always on the defensive. It's always about, you know, how I'm not this and not that. He's not so revising history, and also it's, you know, he's too busy defending himself. I can't really assess, you know, what he's offering to the table, you know.
Okay. Understandable. Unity lang daw. Okay na yun.
I mean, feminists can agree with unity.
And for me, the fact that Sara Duterte is his running mate, and he obviously has the backing of the current administration. So it's that basically makes him like the Darth Vader to me.
Oh
you know,
my.
May red flag.
Yeah.
the dark side.
While
So
we're at his running mate, what do you think about Sara Duterte? You know, as a woman who recently
She made
confirmed
some,
she's also an LGBT. I don't know what
Ang
does
lab,
that mean. Yeah,
ang
but
labo nung sinabi nun.
yeah,
yeah,
ano ba siya?
yeah,
LGBT. But anyway,
yeah.
what do you think about Sara Duterte? Yeah.
Um, yeah, she's a Duterte. So I don't think she has differentiated or distinguished herself enough from
Mm.
from her political dynasty, as it were.
Okay.
So
She's a
she's
woman.
still, yeah, and that makes it worse, you know.
Okay.
And you're the face of EJK, you know.
Oh
I
goodness.
mean, yeah. Yeah, so for me, she's just Duterte Jr.
Okay.
Okay,
Fair enough.
okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Then we have Isko Moreno.
Okay. He comes across to me as kind of a grandstander, you know.
Oh.
He's such a, yeah. He's more of a politician. He's very political, you know.
Yes.
Trapong-trapo ba?
Yes, I think that's the term. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, you get this. He's very concerned about his self-image.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I like his platform. At least he has a platform.
Mhm.
You know, his housing projects and
Okay.
his proposals for labor, health,
Mhm.
and infrastructure.
Yes.
So at least in comparison to the others, you know, if Robredo doesn't win, for example,
Mhm.
you know, I would prefer it to be Isko or
Uh-huh.
Lacson as
Okay.
opposed to Pacquiao, you know. I mean,
Uh-huh.
so yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, I'm not a political pundit. So
Okay lang,
Sure.
okay lang, okay lang.
I
Well,
don't feel qualified assessing
it's
them
fine.
individually.
I think of it as like what to say past talk, but it's well we spent a bit of time. I don't know. You mentioned Lacson. You know, what do you think about quickly, and
Yes.
then
For the
Pacquiao?
women's vote. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lacson, yeah, he's one of those candidates. Again, I'm hearing more of a defense than an offense. You know,
Uh-huh.
Mm.
yeah, he's so busy defending himself and rationalizing why he ran away and didn't face the music. You know,
Okay.
the allegations about those killings and all that.
Mhm.
But I hear that he's a seasoned politician and all that. But yeah, you know, he already has
Mm.
for me his record is not clean anymore.
Wow.
Mm.
And that disqualifies him
Yeah.
for
Mhm.
me, you know.
Okay.
And
Manny
for
Pacquiao.
Pacquiao, I mean, he said some really dumb things in the past, you know. And he's this Bible, for me, he's this Bible thumping. For all that he's a well-meaning man, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't go with his rather medieval views about
Okay.
homosexuality
Mhm.
and so yeah, but I'm
Yeah.
not
Well,
my favorite.
Yeah. It's a
Okay.
fine. I mean, he has softened on that, but again, the damage has been done. And what
Yeah.
we can say, maybe he
Mhm.
is, despite being like a warrior, a boxer, very traditionally masculine, he is also perhaps represents like behind every great man are great women. In this case, Jinky Pacquiao, who I
Akala ko si Mami
sense,
Junisha, lo.
or Mommy Janisa. There you go. Very great
Mm.
women behind him. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
I sense she's the one doing their PowerPoint. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
And anyway, but thank you for their quick like assessment on all of them. Very interesting takes, particularly on Robredo. Like she could still be better despite being a very formidable candidate and a woman. You know, a woman candidate. It's very, especially when a lot of people are saying the future is female. You know, the last man standing is a woman. A very positive things. Yeah. So perhaps before we wrap this conversation up, perhaps we can ask you to do like an open message for, right, for instance, first fellow feminists, and for those who are not feminists. So just quickly, the floor is now yours. So just an open message to feminists, other feminists like you, and those who are not.
Okay. I'm not sure if people think of themselves that way. If you're not a
Okay.
feminist, if you're not a feminist, you're a non-feminist. So I like to think of the label as, of course, I'm biased as a feminist philosopher. You know, I think of the label feminist as comparable to, let's say, rational or critical. So that if you're not a feminist, what are you, non-rational? Are you non-critical? You know, so I think of it as a necessary intellectual lens. So that a person who still consciously evades the label and would go as far as this, you know, have a disclaimer on saying that they're not a feminist, you know, I would be very suspicious of that person, especially as an intellectual, you know.
Well, to be fair, I
Yeah.
think Borge here right now just admitted that he does have his reasons. But again, it's out of limitations
Oh,
and not
okay,
like
I
a
see.
irrationality. I mean,
I see what you mean. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, so I think for people who consider themselves as a non-feminist, you know, it may be because of a certain idea that they have about feminism. So
Right.
it might be different from my own definition of feminism, which is just that very basic advocacy of, you know, if you're for women's rights and the rights of women and girls, if you don't feel, if you feel like, you know, they have rights, that they are human rights, then I think you're automatically a feminist. So yeah, I like to stick to that very simple definition. It might, which if you think about it, it might sound like a simple definition, but sometimes it can be really tested, you know, and it becomes
Sure.
a test of your decency. So yeah, so for me, it's that distinction, feminist, non-feminist, is comparable to, you know, racist, non-racist, you know. So yeah, so if we like to think of ourselves as not being racist, we want to think of ourselves as not being sexist as well, in the same way that we're not ableists or ageists or what, classists or all those isists. So yeah, so for feminists, so congratulations, you know, first of all, and for yeah, it's so funny, you know, answering the question, you know, because I have the question itself is so yeah. So for people who are not feminists, just think about that, you know. I think the alternative to being a feminist is being a sexist. So surely,
Well,
you know
you're
what?
just the weird thing about that is you just said that Lenny Robredo can be more feminist. So are you saying that
Oh
she is
yes,
a
I see
sexist?
what.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I see what you mean. To the extent that she's against abortion rights.
Okay. I suppose maybe a better way to rephrase it is, what can we do more for women, or how can we be more feminist? You know, what is needed in this time right now, you know?
Okay. What's the I would think, well, my bias as a philosopher would be to favor more discernment, more willingness to think contradictions, to think nuances, and to think contexts.
Okay.
And to be more tolerant of debates, and to think of debates and open-ended discussions as the status quo, as ends in themselves rather than as a means to an end, you know. So yeah, so tolerance, I guess, and a certain passion, we live in such dark times, and I think at any point in history a person could say that, right? I mean, once times are always dark. I mean, just emerging from COVID, then now we have war. Which, if you think about it, has always been around. I mean, war has always been kind of the status quo in many parts of the world. It's just that,
right,
now that it's in quote unquote Europe, it's in the headlines. But still, diba, it's still all very depressing. So I think we need, in addition to tolerance, I think we need passion, the energy to keep going, and to not give in to the urge to just throw up your hands and say that it's an absurd world and there's nothing we can do about it. Yeah.
right.
Okay. So yes, sorry for those very general. They're very abstract. So I'm
right. I think it's a fair message. Yeah, I do agree with that we do need more open-ended discussions, and we do need more nuance, because to be quite frank, I don't know if I label myself as a feminist. Of course, I am for equal treatment of women. I respect and love women. I have a lot of my role models are women, but at the same time, I think what is extra challenging is that is in a way not enough to be considered feminist. And while it is a necessary lens for certain issues, I can also see how it is not for everyone. But at the same time, it is a conversation that we always should make and remind ourselves that it's like there is, again, we must not forget there are women in the market, women businessmen, women laborers, women indigenous people, and they all have a voice, and they are worth hearing at the very least. So that is, I suppose, in politically, those who explicitly name themselves feminist would always look at that lens, and it's not always the priority. Like, perhaps in COVID and more, it's not always the priority or like the first thing that comes up to your head, but it could be useful in certain cases, like you mentioned about caring, how women are caregivers. Perhaps it's an alternative framework. In fact, some people would claim that certain countries have handled COVID better because they had like a woman in charge. Again, it could be, some people say it's shallow, but might be something there. It's a different framework instead of like a war framework, like our retired generals in the Philippines headed our COVID, and look where we are now. But it could be more than just the sex of the leaders, but maybe the way that they interact politically. And I suppose that is something to always consider. There's always something women specifically can provide, or like how femininity as opposed to masculinity. Of course, what I'm worried of, and I think, of course, I don't assume all feminists are like this, but there are feminists, and you can admit that there are more, again, radical, fringe or groups that say women should dominate, or women are because like who exclude people from a conversation because they don't have vagina. So no vagina, no uterus, no opinion. So that's a bit against your message of like discussion. And so I suppose we should be worried of the excesses of that. But you're right in saying that it is something we should talk about, the nuance. Borg, do you have anything to say in regards to what we learned about feminism?
No, this had been a very fruitful conversation. So again, thank you, Dr. Dela Cruz, for the rundown on feminism. But yeah, I think I need to ponder more on myself. But I'll be clear, I'm all for gender equality. But as Matt said, there are certain issues that may be more, more critical at this point in human history. So, kahit na ano, I'm relatively libertarian regarding gender, but kahit na anong gusto niyo, bahala kayo. But and of course, equal rights for all. But
yeah,
that's also the limitation of liberalism. When you advocate for equal rights in the context of political and economic inequalities, you need to advocate also for equalization, which is a different issue altogether. So, and equalization is a very tricky matter, because I think that's the radical feminists. That's what they want. They want to equalize by tipping over the system on its head, which is I don't know. It's just the other side of the coin about the failure of revolutions in the 19th century. The revolutions failed because they disregarded women. So you have the American and the French revolutions.
Yes.
They had the rights of man, but just literally man. Even for the French Revolution, much of it was led by women. So, and yeah, so you really cannot correct that failure by just reversing it. So that's my take on the radical feminist. But yeah, I think it's a lens that we need to, as a theory. I think I need to be more aware about feminist theory right now. That's why I'm not comfortable calling myself as a feminist, even if I would defend women's rights to the hilt. But I would. That's because I'm not that grasp with the feminist theory. So, but yeah, much to think about.
Right. And quite frankly, I think because we are biologically male, we're not exactly the most qualified to be feminists. But we may speak like, say, of course, we respect and believe in equality, but what more can we say? We prefer to let the women speak.
Yeah, I think that's a more appropriate way to deal with it. You let women speak. So yeah, I think that caps off my comment on it. We should let women speak. They have been disregarded in history for a long time. So their voice had been, this is a marginalization. So in music, you have
women composers, really.
Yeah, Clara Schumann would be there. She's been relatively marginalized. She's a
very great,
very great pianist alongside her husband Robert Schumann. And then the tragedy of Mahler's wife, Gustav Mahler's wife, that Mahler forced his wife to give up composing.
Wow.
That's a tragedy. So yeah, women in music had been.
I remember that this also reminds me of Einstein. I think he also had a girlfriend who was smarter than he had higher scores than him, but eventually when they started dating and married eventually, he reduced her to a research assistant, even though she was a capable physicist in her own right. So Albert Einstein himself has marginalized the woman he loved and who was a mother to her child, to the point where she was institutionalized because she was so intelligent but was so belittled. Anyway, but I got that from I got from his biographies. But anyway, speaking of letting women speak, let us move on to recommendations. Where we can again talk about, recommend other things that we can think about women's issues and feminism. So as the guest, we'll let you go first on what you want to recommend, because in particular, Borj and I, but more Borj, lack women authors in our libraries. So, So what can you recommend for us?
Okay. Well, off the top of my head, of course, is The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. And coincidentally, in relation to what you two have said, your reservations about the label feminist, I get that. And Beauvoir actually has an explanation for that. In the introduction to The Second Sex, she talks about why women's liberation is harder to fight for than, let's say, the liberation of Black people or the proletarians. Because if you think about racial movements, they've achieved that. Class movements, they've achieved that. But women's movement is still an ongoing, is always contested. And that kind of speaks of the relative priority that gender has in relation to race, class, and all these other aspects of being a person. So that's understandable. So when you think of feminism, it doesn't automatically kind of puts you of the whole world in mind in the way that race or class does. So if you think of feminism, there's this notion that it's just for women and this is just for half the world, But I think this is where feminism is heading into now, third wave feminism and intersectionality, an increasing attention to, not just gender, but everything that goes with it. So it's a very, very, so as you've said, it's a useful lens now. So I think that's, and what makes the second sex so interesting to me, if you could read one book about feminism, it should be that. Because even though it was written back in the 1940s, it was translated in English in 1949, it's still very relevant today. So even the most contemporary debates, it's like when she was writing this back in the 1940s, she anticipated all of those, So yeah, the second sex, definitely one of my recommends. Another one would be an anthology that I co-edited. Anvil published it back in 2011. Unfortunately, it's out of print now. It's part of the DLSU Centennial publication. I'll write it down in the chat. The title is Feminista, Race, Class, and Gender. So this is as comprehensive as we could produce it, as an anthology about feminist issues, in the Philippines, so Feminista, Race, Class, and Gender in the Philippines. So it's really an anthology of written by most of the writers are my own colleagues in the philosophy department. So it talks about a wide range of issues. There's even an article there about weddings and rock, and patriarchy, gangbang, so I wish Anvil would reissue it. A lot of people have been asking me about it, but they couldn't get a hold of a copy. And finally,
there are copies in libraries. I'm sorry, and I actually looked for it.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think they have one copy in Shopee. We'll put a link to where you can buy that on the show notes. So yeah, it's a great book.
Thank you so much.
And then the last one, go ahead.
Okay, and last one, I would recommend this most recent issue on gender by the philosophy journal Critique. They have a special issue on gender. It's actually the volume 14, number 1. So this is about women and philosophy. And one of the articles here is by myself. This is where I talk about global care chains. And the others are special topics, feminist paradigms, and so forth. So it's a very, if you want to read about the latest, about feminism in the Philippines, this is a worthwhile issue to peruse. So it was published back in June 2020. And of course, and finally last, our Beyond the Ghetto Substack newsletter. I encourage your listeners, to subscribe. In fact, our latest issue, we're on the 26th issue now. It's written by one of our colleagues who's living in Belgium. She's doing her PhD there, and she wrote about joining a protest rally, a Women's Day march, against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for the recommendations.
Thank you for the recommendations.
And Borj, do you have anything to recommend? This
again, I don't have many women in my my life. I only have Aaron, Move, and Rahel Yegi. But regarding my recommendation, I think I would have 3 recommendations. And first one would be The Return to Political by Chantal Mouffe. One of the chapters in this book, The Return to Political, relates feminism with the construction of democratic citizenship. So that's the root of my question earlier on. It's from the book. So The Return of the Political by Chantal Mouffe. The other book that I would like to recommend, this is by Rahel Yegi. The title is Alienation. And her theory of alienation actually broke the back of the entire corpus of alienation from Marx until more recent. So it's a landmark work on alienation. So yeah, and I'm really impressed by her work on it. She's basically one of my foundations on my own studies on alienation, to Rahel Yegi. And the last recommendation I have is there are so many movies right now that are trying to rehabilitate historical figures, women historical figures. So, but I would like to recommend the film Agora.
Yes.
The biopic
Yep.
on the women philosopher and mathematician Hypatia.
Oh.
Yeah.
So it's not only about her conflict with men per se, but her conflict with religion,
women.
because she lived at the time of the resurgence of Christianity and anti-intellectual tendencies, anti-women tendencies. So she had to suffer through that. But yeah, it's a 2009 film, so Agora.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Those are great ones. I did not expect those.
Meron naman akong kala mo naman
There's always surprises in the recommendations. All right. I also have 3 recommendations. I'll start with the longest one. The first one is a book which I'm still reading. It's called Sexual Personae, Art and Decadence from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson by Camille Paglia. And Camille Paglia is a feminist, but she's actually not very quote unquote popular because she is actually very critical of the mainstream feminism. On the one hand, one of her famous rebuttals is like women should also have responsibility in rape because sometimes rape situations are made from women's mistakes. Of course, that sounds victim blaming, but if you listen to it, like why would you go into a car, for example, when with a man when it's partial consent according to her? But again, it's worth
controversial.
But controversial, but it's not for her opinions that I'm recommending. It's also her work on art criticism, and in this book in particular is based on her dissertation. She talks about the depiction of women all the way to the Greeks and the Egyptians, wherein even though there's a so-called patriarchal society, they have these varied depiction of female strength. You have the depiction of Artemis, who is a huntress, but who is also beautiful, but somewhat she's known for being a virgin, but she's a militant virgin. So she's also a hunter. And also the Amazonesses, who the weird part is that the real historical Amazones usually cut off their breasts because to be able to shoot arrows because they would get in the way. But the statues, they would keep, of course, them unblemished in that because it went against their idea of womanhood. So there's these debates and depictions of women. You have the Gorgon, which is the feminine strength. It's a monstrous, but also feminine and beautiful, which is weird. So she talks about androgyny throughout the ancient world and how women have been, in a way, both controlled. The depictions of women are controlled, but also depict this otherworldliness and this anxiety. It's actually her argument is that men are actually afraid and anxious of women and therefore need to somehow control them. But at the same time, she should realize that it's not about women being more like men, but women realize the power in their womanhood. So that's the core message of her brand of feminism. Not blaming men, but also blaming women for failing to take responsibility for their womanhood. So that's another one. The other one is a movie called Liwai. I think I've talked about this movie before, but it was in Cinema Line 2018 and talks about a female commander of the CPP-NPA. And it depicts the story of her, of course, in the wilderness, but also raising a family. Like apparently, I don't know if this is a spoiler, but it's about it's based on the life of the director's mother. So it's the real life CPP-NPA general during the Marcos era. And so she's a symbol of both like strength, but also feminine sensitivity. So I don't know if you can watch it, but it should be out in the internet somewhere out there. I'll try to find the link. And one last one, and I think this is the shortest recommendation, but it's very beautiful. It's called Bread and Roses. It's a song, it's an activist song, but it's based on a poem by James Oppenheimer, I think. And it's the lyrics sung by of course the women's movement. And it goes something like this: as we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. So, of course, bread represents their needs. They need to eat bread to survive, but also roses, meaning like dignity or being able to enjoy life, enjoy privilege. And this one is my favorite one. As we come marching, marching, we battle to for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. So it's also that connection between men and women. It's not a battle of the sexes, but realizing women's role in society's liberation. So this, I'll post a link to a much better performance of the song, which is depicted in like Pride. I'm trying to remember who sang it. I'll put it on the show notes, but that's a song that I think anyone, male or female, feminist or not, if you're not, should listen to if you want to, again, understand the role of women in politics. So, yeah. Okay. That is, I think this is our longest episode.
Yeah, it's a very fruitful episode.
Oh.
Yeah. But again, no, that's not it's letting you like women speak. Again, it's very, we learned a lot actually.
Yep,
so
we did.
Thank you very much, Ms. Noelle, for your insights and for letting us speak, and also for the recommendations. Any last words before we wrap this up completely? Yeah.
Thank you so much for this space and for your advocacy of women's voices. And we hope to hear more women's voices in your podcast.
Yes.
Now that I've become a fan as well.
Yeah.
So thank you for this opportunity. And it's so much fun conversing with you guys. We should do this more often, face to face.
Yes. Hopefully this is not the last.
Yep. Soon.
So yes, and that is understanding feminism, and of course, we'll try to get more women on the show. My goodness,
but men are afraid of women.
and we're both confirmed bachelors. Oh my goodness, so we need to we need to find women. But anyway, but definitely maybe next Women's Month. Hopefully, okay.
It's Mother's Day.
Mother's Day, hopefully. Okay, so the PI podcast can be found on Spotify, YouTube, and Anchor. If you want to send us an email, you can do that at pipodcastph@gmail.com. But until the next episode,
magandang gabi, mga ka-PI.